Welcome, everybody.
Brief feedback form, and then you'll be emailed a certificate of attendance if you're here live with us tonight. Here's what that email will look like. You'll see again at the top, it says the Reading League Zephy. That's where to watch to see these emails coming. I plan to send them out on Mondays after tomorrow morning. Tomorrow will be our first one, and then every Monday for the next 6 weeks. At the header, you'll see what week it is so that you'll know where we are in our pacing guide and can adjust your reading accordingly or connect with us in that way. Every email will have just a couple of assignments each week, something to read, so a chapter or two each week, something to watch. Either this kickoff session will be in your first email tomorrow, or content from the authors. They've recorded a session to help give a deep dive into the content and then have a little bit of a discussion about what they're hearing in schools and how to make the most of the content that they've provided in the book. There will also be links to additional resources that are related to that content, things to explore in the world of MTSS and research-based resources for you to explore, and then a note from Dr. Stollar and any final reminders. Our two of the three authors are joining us, Dr. Kim Gibbons and Dr. Sarah Brown. They introduced themselves in this video, so you'll hear from them very soon. But I wanted to share just a little snippet about what the content is like. If you've ever read a book and maybe found yourself wondering, oh, I love what they said here, but I wish I could ask a follow-up question, or I wish they talk a little bit more about this, these videos are for you. It's just a candid conversation, it feels like, with the authors talking about effective universal instruction. So let's listen in.
So I think if you were to ask the question, like, what is it out there that works that will cause some type of an impact on whatever behavior we're trying to change or outcome, the answer is probably just about anything will produce some type of an effect. And I think where we're at right now as a country, with pretty low proficiency rates across the board and literacy and really large achievement gaps for different groups of students, we need to ask the question, what works best? And that's where research can really help us. So it's not as much about like, what's our neighboring school district using to try to improve reading outcomes or math outcomes. It's really looking back at the research and the accumulation of research. So just one study that's out there with a small group of kids that says, do this and you'll get an increase in reading comprehension. I think going back to the science of reading and that term, and we think it's an accumulation of research over decades, and replication is like one of the hallmarks when we talk about science and research. So I would just, again, really think about that when you're making decisions, is look for that accumulation of evidence that would impact, that would say, if you do this, there's a really good likelihood that there's going to be a high return on closing those gaps and really increasing proficiency with a student or groups of students.
Isn't that great? I'm sending just an ocean of gratitude to Kim and Sarah for putting those videos together, and I can't wait to share them with you over the coming weeks. I will email you this pacing guide tomorrow morning so you can kind of see what's coming. But again, we made this very manageable, 1 or 2 chapters a week with a recording link to that optional content that's between 40 and 60 minutes to listen to the authors talk about the topics each week, wrapping up by July 29th. I have to say a huge thank you to chapter leaders for pulling all of the resources together. This would not have been possible without a team effort. So you can see the names here of all the individual chapter leaders from across the country that volunteered to take on some aspect in hosting these sessions, in preparing quotes to put on social media, in making the feedback forms and certificates. So thank you to all. It truly does take a league, and we have a great one here. All right, I'm now excited to introduce to you Dr. Stephanie Stollar. She's the founder of the Stephanie Stollar Consulting LLC and the creator of the Reading Science Academy. She's also a part-time assistant professor in the online reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University and a founding member of a national alliance for supporting reading science in higher education. As a board member for the Innovations in Education Consortium, she collaboratively plans the annual MTSS Innovations in Education Conference. Dr. Stollar has worked as a school psychologist, an educational consultant, and as Vice President for Professional Learning for Acadians Learning. She's passionate about improving educator knowledge and aligning school systems to prevent reading failure. There are two things that I personally have come to appreciate about Dr. Stollar over the last few years. The first one is her clarity on really big, complex topics like MTSS. The way that she combines research and her experience to provide practical and meaningful guidance for educators is remarkable. The first time I heard her present on MTSS, I took 6 pages of handwritten notes, so I know you're in for a treat tonight. The second thing I really appreciate about Dr. Stollar is her heart for connecting with educators and school leaders who are in the field doing the work. If you see her at a conference, she's always on the move, chatting with teachers, answering questions, and really getting to know the people in this work. I've benefited from more than one email thread with her and appreciate the time that she invests into developing others. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Stephanie Stollar to set the stage for our Summer of Learning.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate that so much. And I want to express my appreciation for everyone connected to one of the state chapters of the Reading League who has been working behind the scenes to make this event possible. I'm really honored to be part of it. This book is actually one of my personal favorites, and I know each one of the authors. So it's really a joy for me to have so many educators who are interested in reading this very informative and practical book together this summer. I'm looking forward to it. So my task this evening is to kick us off with hopefully some thought-provoking and informative bits of information so that you will be ready to dive into this book as soon as possible. I'm going to be starting off by positioning MTSS as the framework for implementing the science of reading. You may not have thought about these two things as being related in the past, and I'm going to try to bring them together. I'm going to make some general comments about what MTSS is, and I'm going to share my experiences and perspective about the way that I view Tier 1 or universal instruction as being really the foundation for preventing reading failure and getting the conditions right for intervention for students who need even intensive interventions. And throughout, thanks to the folks in the Reading League chapters, I'm going to be peppering in some of the quotes from the book, so it'll whet your appetite to get into certain chapters and dig in. So I want to start, first of all, with the definition of the science of reading that is in the Reading League's Science of Reading Defining Guide. You can see the definition on the screen. I'm holding up a copy of the print version of the Defining Guide. There is a free download PDF of the same guide, but we're in June and coming up on the end of those, June 30 budgets where maybe you have a little bit of money left in your district. You might want to purchase some of the hard copies so that everybody in your school or district can be talking about the science of reading from the same definition and really understanding what it is and what it isn't. For me, what I highlighted in purple on the slide is the most important part. It's about effectively assessing and teaching, therefore improving student outcomes through prevention of and intervention for reading difficulties. So this is where the MTSS framework comes in handy. In my experience, sometimes when people talk about the science of reading, they think that it's an it. It's a thing. It's just a bit of information that I can spend time in a workshop or a training and then understand. It's this finite thing I can get my hands around. Or it just means that I need to adopt a different program, swap out the instructional materials I'm using now for something else. And I think if that's been your approach, you're probably quite frustrated because you're not going to be able to just tinker around the edges and sprinkle in a little bit of science into your current way of operating in your school and expect the outcomes for your students to improve dramatically. MTSS is first and foremost a school change model. It is a school-wide reading improvement framework. And to me, it's the overarching framework that directs all of the adult behaviors in school systems, whether that's around social, emotional, behavioral health, whether it's other academic areas, but it's certainly the way that we contextualize and deliver what's known in the reading research. So if you haven't been putting these two things together, this is the one thing I hope you take away from my presentation tonight, is that MTSS is the mechanism, the framework for implementing what's in the reading research. Sometimes when I share information with educators about some of the really useful information that's in the science of reading, they say, well, that's great, but that won't work at my school. Or we can't do that because fill in the blank. All of those realities, all of those challenges, barriers that exist in every single school around the world, those are exactly the things that need to get surfaced so that you can improve reading outcomes. Whatever you currently understand as the barriers, the impediments to better literacy outcomes for your students, that's what MTSS will help you identify and systematically resolve, starting with the way you teach reading the first time around. So starting with a quote from chapter 1 of Effective Universal Instruction, most school districts in this country do not have the resources to intervene their way out of ineffective universal instruction. This has been my mantra for a very, very long time because it is absolutely the truth. If you get your intervention systems in place, if they are lined up with the research and your needs of your students, you'll be able to get some little bumps in outcomes, but you're not going to be able to make dramatic improvements and get all of your students to high levels of literacy. It has to start with classroom reading instruction. As Anita Archer tells us, the magic is in the instruction. So how do we remove barriers that might be currently existing in our system so that our instruction improves? That's what this is all about. One of the most important findings in the reading research, in my opinion, is the fact that we know we can prevent reading problems for the vast majority of students. In fact, we have more evidence about prevention than we do about intervention. We know that we can prevent difficulties before reading problems start with what and how we teach in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade. And this is really where we need to be focusing our attention and our resources. This is the foundation of the multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS model. And it doesn't mean that we can't impact literacy outcomes once students are beyond the end of first grade. It just means it's going to be much more resource intensive than most schools are organized currently to provide. So early in the primary grades, that's where we should be devoting our attention, early in every grade, because the sooner we catch even students who are already struggling readers and provide them with the intervention they need, the more impact we can have eventually on their literacy performance. So this is the origin of the MTSS model, this school improvement approach to delivering what's in the reading research. It really began in public health with the idea of health promotion and disease prevention. And then it was first translated into positive behavior supports, a system of prevention in that realm, and then eventually into academic areas, first in reading. So the picture, the image of this triangle, pyramid, or what I depict as a cone, really is important because it's about resource allocation. It's connected to that research about prevention. We know that if we catch reading difficulties before they start, if we catch reading difficulties early in every grade, we can impact student outcomes, which is the whole point, with fewer resources. So it's a model that helps us to efficiently match the needs of students with the way we're doing business, primarily the way we're allocating resources within our school systems. So the first line of prevention, primary prevention of reading failure, is regular classroom reading instruction, what the book refers to as universal instruction or the universal tier. You'll hear some people talk about it as tier 1 or core reading instruction. That's depicted at the base of this cone image, the green area. Effective universal instruction will cause the vast majority of students to reach your grade level reading targets. And we use 80% as kind of the proxy for vast majority. You're going to need some additional support for students who are still struggling or still at risk in spite of that highly effective first reading instruction in tier 1. And that's what we call secondary prevention of reading failure, or tier 2. Some people call it an intervention system. It should cause another 15% of students to reach your grade level reading expectations. And then even in spite of having effective universal instruction and effective additional dose at tier 2, some students are going to need even more intensive support at tier 3. So as we go up the tiers, the resource allocation, the intensity, the time, the money, the skill of the instructor increases. And it's depicted this way to help us remember that we cannot possibly provide the intensive intervention to students who need it, such as students with reading disabilities like dyslexia, if too many students need intervention. Our intervention systems will become overwhelmed. We won't be able to provide intensive support to students who need it. So the first approach to getting this right for all students is the way we teach reading the first time around in the regular classroom. Rather than waiting for students to have difficulty, rather than waiting for teachers to recognize that students are having a difficulty, we can be proactive and preventative. And that's what the model is really grounded in. At the base of what I'm trying to show as a three-dimensional cone are some system level factors that need to be attended to in order to be able to deliver very effective universal instruction. And I'm going to talk a bit about those factors tonight. From chapter 8 in the book, MTSS is about resources, and more specifically, the efficient use of resources to impact student achievement. If what you're doing is working, you should continue doing it. If it's not working, meaning you're not getting every one of your students to your reading expectations, you should think about making a change. The model originated with some really important assumptions that underlie the work of delivering the reading research in schools. So these are conversation starters. These are things you can talk about with the people you work with, because if you don't all have the same understanding, you're not going to be rowing in the same direction, so to speak. All children can learn, and it's the responsibility of us as the adults in the system to figure out the right way to enable their learning. Students are learning in schools which are complex host environments. This is the truth, right? This is where all of those variables, all of the things that are making it difficult for us to get better outcomes, all of the things that we need to resolve for student learning to happen. Decisions are best made through shared ownership, and that requires leadership. All of you here tonight are going to be leading the charge in your districts. You'll be able to have a vision that you can share with others about doing business differently so you can get a better result for your students. And to connect again to the science of reading, we have evidence in the reading research, and we should be using it to guide the instructional moves that we make in classrooms. The ultimate decision about how we're operating in schools needs to be based on student outcomes. And what's in the research gives us a great place to start. We don't have to wander around blindly and make things up. We can start with what's known in the research. and be focused on outcomes over beliefs and ideology. I want to draw a contrast because some of you may not have been working in education as long as I have, and you might not understand where this MTSS model comes from. You might not even be aware that there was a time back in the 70s when we first started educating all students in schools, where it was mandatory for public schools to serve students with disabilities. And that was a wonderful occurrence and opened up many doors for students who hadn't been previously included in public education. But it also had some unintended consequences, some of the things that you can see that I'm calling the traditional model, the way that we used to behave in schools. So in the 1980s, there was an effort to make changes in the way that we serve all students, students with disabilities, certainly, but primarily the way that we serve students who don't have disabilities, even students who are gifted, in a way that allows us to efficiently match what all students need to the services that we're providing in schools. So MTSS was hatched, not under that terminology, but the concepts were born as an alternative to that old or traditional model of service delivery in schools. And honestly, 30 plus years later, we're still working towards this transformation. So it's exciting. We have so many people who are reading this book as part of this book study this summer. Now that we have universal screening, we don't have to wait for individual students to get referred to a team or for some kind of service. We can identify students much earlier, which is a key component of prevention and early intervention. We don't have to have siloed and segregated service delivery models. We can use our services and our resources flexibly to integrate across general education and special education. We don't have to use a discrepancy model for specific learning disability eligibility, dyslexia being one of the specific learning disabilities. We can use direct assessment data collected over time on students as we are using a collaborative problem-solving model to enable learning, to find what it takes for every student to make progress. And rather than simply informing parents about what we're doing with their children in schools, we can engage them as partners on those collaborative problem-solving teams. So that's a little bit of the history and a contrast in terms of the way MTSS was originally conceptualized as an alternative to some of the ways that we were practicing previously, might still be practicing, that are not serving our students well. And if you recognize some of the things that I was calling the traditional or old way of doing business as still happening in your school, then those would be really good conversations to have within your system. From Chapter 7, having an infrastructure that supports universal tier improvement is essential to change. MTSS requires that a school function as a system, as opposed to separate classrooms that all operate as their own individual educational kingdoms. I think that's funny terminology, because all of you classroom teachers are like, do I have a kingdom? It doesn't feel like I have a kingdom. But you get the point, right? That we need to be in this together. We need to be recognizing that if we find ourselves having the same conversation with a different child's name attached to it, week after week after week, if we find ourselves suggesting the same interventions for a different child week after week after week, maybe there's something systemic that's happening. Maybe we should take a bigger picture view of the way we're doing business in our school to get a different outcome for our students. So my suggestion is that as you're reading this book this summer, that you try to have this perspective, that you try to think about moving away from trying to solve the reading crisis one student at a time, and you try to start thinking about a way to do business differently in your system that will get the maximum result for every student. We have limited resources in schools. We have to be careful about how we allocate resources so that we can get the maximum benefit for the largest number of students from doing the least resource intensive actions. So thinking about your school as a system to improve classroom reading instruction, universal reading instruction, or tier 1, involves considerations in at least 4 areas. And you might notice I'm cheating to keep it on, fingers on one hand. I'm combining some things to make it 4 categories that I want to encourage you to think about. The assessment system, having assessments that will allow you to ask and answer the right questions about your students. You can't do MTSS without a system, a school-wide system of assessments. Tiered instruction, so that idea of getting it right for the masses, the largest proportion of your students with the universal instruction, the way everybody gets taught to read in the ELA block, that has to be so powerful that it reduces the need for something more. That's the tiered instruction and intervention framework. The third component is professional development and coaching. We can't make changes to the adult behaviors in schools without guidance, without new knowledge, and without supports to behave differently. We can't just flip a switch and say, okay, tomorrow we're going to be doing MTSS and all of our problems are going to be solved. We wish it was that easy. It's going to take a sustained effort. It's going to take support for the adults in the system to make this change. And then finally, the fourth component is leading that change, doing it not as a single leader, but doing it in teams where we are, as I said earlier, surfacing the concerns, surfacing the barriers, the things that are standing in our way, and systematically problem solving using our assessment data in a structured decision-making framework for how are we going to eliminate or change that barrier so we get a different result for our students. So I'm going to talk about each one of these. I'm going to go fairly quickly through them because I want to get to those yes buts, those things that people always talk about. Well, yeah, that all sounds great, but in our school, right? I want to get to those. I want to get to some ideas and suggestions about how you can do this problem solving as a team for a different result. I'm going to pause so I can take a drink of water and to see if Erin has any burning questions that she wants me to address.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Erin.
We do have a question from Sarah. I'm curious, do you believe that this is the same post-pandemic, or will we see a shift in support needs and further research?
Well, in my experience, I've been at this for a while. We have had these reading difficulties for a very long time. We have had embarrassing, honestly, reading results in this country, given what we know in the research. So I'm not sure that it's just a post-pandemic phenomenon, although I will say those students who were out of school trying to learn virtually for an entire year or more, they have some significant and unique difficulties that are really challenging for schools. So those need to be dealt with because we may have missed the opportunity. Those students are now 3rd, 4th, 5th graders. So prevention is no longer an option. And so getting our intervention systems in place is really the priority.
Thank you. We also have a question from Jessica who asked, do the 3 tiers exist outside of special education? Several of the schools I've worked with believe that special education and tier 3 are one and the same.
Well, the tiers really are not equated to special education in my experience or view. And students who have disabilities or on IEPs are served in all 3 tiers. So I would not think about tier 1 as being general education and tier 3 as being special education. And I like to encourage people to think about the tiers, and that's where I'm going to go next, as service delivery systems. So we don't have tier 1 students, tier 2 students, and tier 3 students. We have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 systems of service, systems of instruction. Is there a
Thank you.
follow-up to that?
Not yet.
Okay. All right. We'll see,
We're getting
we'll see if
thank yous
if
and
she
preach
adds.
and yes and clapping.
Okay. Oh, good. I
Yeah,
love that because I can't see anybody. So, Erin's smiling. That's always good. But
it's
thank
great.
you for sharing what's in the chat and the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay. So let's unpack these tiers just a bit. And I'm going to try to be brief so that we can get onto the improvement of tier 1 because that's the topic of our book. So just some descriptors. All students receive universal instruction, hence the name, universal. Everybody gets it. The purpose is to prevent reading difficulties for the vast majority of students. The way you teach reading the first time, your regular classroom reading instruction, the ELA block in your day, has the purpose of minimizing risk, of preventing reading failure if you are in kindergarten or first grade. It has the purpose of primary prevention of reading difficulties. Maybe you haven't thought about classroom reading instruction in that way before. In my experience, many people don't. In fact, it's been a historical practice that if students are struggling readers, they are removed from universal instruction. They are removed from tier 1 to get some kind of reading intervention. And what I want to do is change that thinking. I want you to think about designing universal instruction to meet the specific needs of your students, whatever those needs might be. So the amount of time that you need depends on your students. Generally, you're going to hear people talk about 90 to 120 minutes every day of protected time for ELA. But if you have a high needs population, you might need 150 minutes. You might only need 60 minutes. It's a database decision, and it might not be the same number of minutes in every grade level or in every school within your district. What you're doing during that time is more important even than the number of minutes. So here's where we first deliver what's in the reading research. The research base is not there just for intervention. Everything we know that works with students who have reading challenges works to prevent reading failure from happening in the first place. The design and delivery of instruction has a large research base that we should be drawing on, not just when we notice that a student is having difficulty with reading, but to prevent them from having difficulty with reading, because we're using those research-aligned instructional approaches from the get-go, from day 1 of kindergarten. The universal tier is planned by a team, typically a grade level team. Some people call them PLCs. Some people call them teacher-based teams. All of the folks who support students at a particular grade level are involved with using screening data to design universal instruction that gets the vast majority of students, maybe 80%, to your expectations. That's how we know if universal instruction is working. So in the book, in chapter 1, they talk about universal instruction in this way. The universal tier is more than a single textbook. It is all the materials and instruction used to provide the main classroom instruction in a particular content area, or simply put, whatever it takes to get most students to meet grade level standards. That's what the job is of the building leadership team, the grade level team, to get instruction right based on what students need. Now, even with very effective universal instruction, some students are going to need something more. The purpose of tier 2 is to accelerate progress, not just meet students where they are and accommodate them there, but meet them where they are and accelerate their progress so that they catch up. This can be done in some additional instructional minutes outside of the universal tier. So students don't come out of their universal instruction to get tier 2 or tier 3 intervention or speech therapy or some kind of tutoring or EL service. Everybody gets that universal instruction. Some students are going to need more. One of the things that is very clear in the research is that students who are struggling can catch up, but not in the same number of minutes and not with the same kind of instruction. They need more and better instruction for their progress to be accelerated and for them to catch up. So the instruction that we're giving students in the intervention tier at tier 2 needs to be aligned to what's happening in tier 1 so that students who are at risk or struggling readers are not more confused by having different routines, a different scope and sequence, a different set of terminology to talk about the things that they're learning, and so on. And you'll know if your tier 2 system of support is working if it causes another 15% of students to reach your grade level expectations. Then even with very effective tier 1 and tier 2, some students are always going to need very resource intensive support, but they too can reach those grade level expectations. This is a matter of intensifying what's happening in tier 2. This is not necessarily, although in some cases it might be, a different program or a different instructor. This is extending, making more intensive in terms of more time, a longer dose, a more highly trained instructor, more frequent progress monitoring, more explicit and systematic instruction. All of those variables are the ways that we intensify from tier 2 to tier 3. So there's a permeable barrier there, and it should go in both directions, not just up from 1 to 3. It should go from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 1 as well. This is the time when we get a team of folks, including the child's family members and community members, to do that individual student problem solving. For the universal tier, for tier 2, we're doing that problem solving, not student by student. That's the old intervention assistance team model. We don't need to do that anymore. We're doing that efficient planning of tiers 1 and 2 as a grade level team or a school level team. But when it comes to intensive support, we have to do individual student problem solving. That is what allows us to accelerate progress for those students and get them to the grade level expectations as well. From chapter 4 in effective universal instruction, the only way we have the ability to intensify frequency, duration, and group size is by maximizing the impact of our universal tier. This is where I started. The purpose of universal instruction is to shrink risk. You can't possibly deliver what I just described as tier 2 and tier 3 supports to half of the grade level. And yet that's the mistake I see so many people doing. They're skipping over the universal tier altogether. They're going from results on a screener, and if a student scores below expectation, they go straight to tier 2. And if they score well below expectation, they go straight to tier 3. And that is flooding your intervention systems. It is diluting whatever you have, stretching it so thin, whatever you call intervention in your system, to the place where it can't possibly accelerate progress and catch students up. You've actually, in those cases, skipped over the very most important time of a student's day, the universal tier. Think about it. They spend most of their reading instructional minutes in the regular classroom. That's the environment we have to maximize. That's the environment we have to align to what students need. So the second core component at the base of my image of the 3-tiered model is the assessment system, because how are we going to know what our universal instruction should look like unless we have good assessments. School districts implementing an MTSS framework typically engage in assessment for 4 purposes: screening, diagnostic, progress monitoring, and outcome evaluation. And there's a whole chapter in the Effective Universal Instruction book, chapter 3, talking about assessment. So these are the purposes that we have to make sure we have tools for in our system. Universal screening, fortunately, is becoming much more prevalent and common. You can't do reading improvement efforts without universal screening. I think about this as the check engine light in your car's dashboard. This is the quick, early warning that something's not right. Universal screening is answering the question, which students and systems need support. So universal, meaning all students get it. Because we're doing it 3 times a year, it has to be brief. We want to be able to compare student A to student Z. So we need a standardized testing environment. We need tools for screening that are reliable and valid. And perhaps most importantly, we need to screen with indicators of what research tells us are the essential early literacy skills. People call these the big 5: phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, vocabulary and oral language. I made the balloons go up. That's fun. Text reading fluency and reading comprehension. Indicators of what research tells us are essential components of reading. That's what we should be screening on. And we need universal screening tools that are predictive of future reading outcomes. I feel really strongly that early literacy screening should not be just about sorting students. It's not about putting kids into categories, who's on track, who's not on track. That's important to know, but more importantly, we need to act on the information. We need instructionally relevant screening and diagnostic tools that will give us information to design a system of supports, design those 3 tiers of instruction. So in addition to universal screening, we need tools for diagnostic assessment. This does not mean diagnosing a disability. This means answering the question, exactly what should we teach next? Universal screening is just telling us a ballpark, which of the 5 areas is the student having difficulty with. Diagnostic assessment goes deep into that area to tell us exactly what to teach tomorrow. These are 2 assessment purposes, screening and diagnostic. You can't use the same tool for those 2 different purposes. Now, fortunately, some universal screening tools are also designed to be used for progress monitoring. You'll see some of the same characteristics and features that I described for universal screening. But the added feature that you want to look for when choosing progress monitoring tools is that it measures growth in short increments of time. It functions like a GPS for educators. It tells you, should I keep teaching the way I'm teaching? Should I stay on track, on course? Or should I make a change to my instruction because it doesn't seem to be working? Progress monitoring is not about documenting failure. Progress monitoring is feedback to the instructor. Should I make a change to my instruction? And you can see it on a graph if the change that you made worked or not. The 4th purpose of assessment is summative. Looking back at the end of the year, this is the typical achievement testing that we do in schools. Did students meet our objectives and standards? So, Erin, I'm going to pause here and see if there are any burning questions about purposes of assessment before I move on. Any confusion to clear up?
We have a lot of questions coming in here, so we're trying to sort them out.
Triage.
Some about scheduling.
Okay, we're going to talk about scheduling in a bit.
So we'll pause that. And we're also looking at during tier time, but I don't see anything about assessment at this minute, except we had a very early question about the shift away from universal screeners such as Acadians and Dibbles and moving to something such as NWEA MAP, iReady, etc. How do we eke out the results that we need as you train as an Acadian, some of us, as these other screeners?
Yeah, I don't think you can. I don't think you can do MTSS with a computer adaptive assessment. Some of them are just as accurate as Acadians or Dibble's 8th edition at sorting students into on track, likely to be okay in the future, not likely to be okay unless they get support. But the instructional relevance of those computer adaptive assessments is what's missing. And so you can't really do any kind of instructional planning with those tools. And you certainly can't do progress monitoring. So you're going to have a direct curriculum-based measure anyway. So why not just use that for your screening? So that's my my opinion, since I was the person asked the question.
And then we do have another question about diagnostic assessment. What is an example of a diagnostic assessment? Would these be administered by teachers? And a follow-up question by another attendee asks, what are some of the best diagnostics to give?
Yeah, so diagnostic assessment should be given when you don't know what to teach next, when you're not sure. Like, you know, a student's not an accurate reader of text, but you don't know which phonics patterns they know and don't know. So some good diagnostics, I like the ones from Acadians. They have diagnostics in all 5 essential skill areas. There are some free ones out there from Really Great Reading, from Core. If you've taken letters, there's spelling inventory that's available to you there. Those all function as instructionally relevant diagnostics, and that's what you want to look for. Something that helps you know what to teach next.
Thank you.
Okay, so in chapter 1, the authors make the point: teaching staff must receive sufficient and ongoing professional learning to deliver the universal instructional program in the way it was designed, or in the way that they are designing it, right? So professional development is the third component underneath multi-tiered systems of support for delivering the science of reading. You're going to have a plan across years for consistent learning in your school community beyond just the staff, and job embedded ongoing coaching, not just around the topics that we would think of as the science of reading, but in terms of how to work together as teams, delivering and using the assessments that you've chosen, and the piece that most people don't yet know how to do, the database decision making, or what I call collaborative problem solving. So that's the last component that I want to touch on. This is where I want to get into those yes buts, those barriers, and how you resolve them. In the book, in chapter 5, the authors say, once implementation barriers have been identified, schools should prioritize those barriers to address those that are most likely to result in supporting improved implementation of desired practices. And obviously, it's all for results. So having a structure to the way that you use your assessment data is the backbone of MTSS. And yet this is what I find is the piece that most people are not doing. They're doing screening. They might even be collecting diagnostic data. They might even be doing some progress monitoring, but they don't have a system in which to make decisions about those data. Lots of data, not very many decisions, and scattered actions. Even if schools are doing a good job thinking through this problem-solving process about individual students, most of them are not taking it to the systems level. If you're in a situation like this school, where 63% of the first graders are below or well below expectation, the screening data should inform your universal tier. In this context, do all students need the same thing? Should phonics instruction be done in a whole group or a small group format? Should you implement a program with Fidelity? Could you possibly provide intervention to 63% of the first graders and have that intervention catch the students up? These are the questions the grade level team should be asking and answering. Once you have your screening data, you need to sit down as a team. You need to think about the way you're currently doing business, identify those barriers to better outcomes, learn about what's in the reading research, and make changes to the way you do business. From chapter 4, are at least 80% of students meeting expectations at each grade level without additional intervention? That's an important part. It's not 80% in general get to your expectations. It's your universal tier causes 80%. First reading instruction, classroom reading instruction, only, no intervention, should be so powerful that it reduces risk to something manageable, only 20% needing intervention. Are there gaps in the percentage of subgroups of students meeting expectations? Are you effective and doing a good job for some students and not so much for others? This is an important consideration. We need to disaggregate the screening data. We need to be looking under the hood to see for whom are we effective to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our students. So I'm going to give you a short list. I'm going to give you some barriers that I typically encounter, a list of 5 things for you to consider, rather than asking you to try to figure out what should you pay attention to if you find yourself in this unenviable situation of having only 17% of your first graders who are meeting the benchmark goal. What should you consider changing? I'm going to suggest that you think about these 5 elements of the way you do business in your school. Now, I'm giving a first grade example, but this applies to all grade levels. Once you've identified that you have a systems level problem, you have a problem with universal instruction, you can systematically collect some data in each of these 5 areas to make changes so that you are action planning, not about an individual student, but action planning about the universal instruction. There are factors, variables, components of the quality of that classroom reading instruction that can be analyzed and improved. And that's what this book is all about. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights here, and we'll see what questions you have. So the first on my list that you might consider, if you have more students, more than 20% at any grade level who are not meeting your expectations around reading. What do your educators, not just teachers, all educators, administrators, related service folks know about the science of reading? Now, I have a picture of a refrigerator here. I recently had my refrigerator break down. It was no longer keeping things cold. And because I don't have any background knowledge about the workings of a refrigerator, I had no problem solving skills. I didn't know what to check. I didn't know what to look into. I didn't know what to jiggle or unplug or try to, free up or loosen up. I had nothing. When the technician came to my house, he had all of that knowledge and experience that he brought to this problem. That's what I think we need in terms of connecting the science of reading to the systems that we're building in MTSS. And I want to just very briefly suggest that there are 2 areas that I think should be the primary focus of building professional knowledge, building community knowledge, and that includes the simple view of reading, this idea that reading comprehension can be explained at the highest level through 2 capacities. And both of these capacities are necessary. One is not more important than the other. They don't fight with each other. They both have to be taught explicitly from day one. And no amount of one of them can make up for difficulties in the other. This is one of the most important findings. More than 100 research studies have confirmed that these two broad areas, word recognition and language comprehension, contain all the complexity of what it takes to be a reader. They explain almost everything there is about reading comprehension. So this is a big idea that every member of your school community should understand, so that their teaching is lined up to this research, assessment is lined up to this research, and intervention is guided by this research. The second big idea that I think everyone in your school community should investigate is what's called the learning hierarchy. This comes not just from reading science, but from the science of learning. That when humans learn something new, when you are a novice, when you have perhaps tried something and you are struggling with it, you need to go through a sequence of experiences that take you from first being accurate in this new behavior or skill to then becoming fluent and automatic, having the thinking about it go underground in your consciousness. And then last but not least, you can apply, generalize, and transfer to new settings this new skill or knowledge. So I have a picture of someone driving a car here, because I think this is the best non-academic example of the learning hierarchy. When you teach your child to drive, I know it's a scary experience. You first are teaching them to operate that car accurately in a controlled environment, like an empty parking lot. And then you gradually increase the, you take away the scaffolds, right? You go out into more and more complex situations and different types of roads and driving conditions, because now that new driver is no longer a novice. They are not only accurate, but they are fluent. And eventually they can drive, hopefully not text, but talk on the phone, drink coffee, think about their grocery list. They can get into any rental car in any country and drive successfully. This is what we want when it comes to reading. The more that everyone in your system understands that this is how learning happens, the more effective you will be as an instructor or an interventionist or a parent for that matter, because you'll be able to position your child, your student, on this learning hierarchy. You'll be able to look out into your class of 30 and understand where your students are on the learning hierarchy on every skill and new piece of information that you're teaching them. And the more you line up and match where they are on this hierarchy to your instruction, the faster you can accelerate their progress. In chapter 2 of the book, creating a syllabus or a scope and sequence of professional learning topics for an entire school year provides a vision for the learning. This is an important part of MTSS. It's not something that we do. MTSS is a framework. It's a process. It's a way of thinking. It's something that is developed and supported over time. It's an ongoing process. Okay, the second thing that might be in your way of getting better results from your universal tier is your schedule. Now, a couple of things that I want to bring to your attention related to your schedule. Having enough minutes is important. You're going to have to struggle with this because every administrator knows that the schedule is a beast. This is not an easy thing to accomplish, but you've got to start with the baseline of having the planned minutes for instruction in the day. And that includes not just the universal tier, but the second dose of instruction at another time of day, tier 2 or tier 3. And you can see in this school's schedule across kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, they were using what I refer to as flexible service delivery. And I'll talk more about this in just a minute, where their resource personnel were pushing in to differentiate their tier 1. Their screening data indicated that there were so many students, 60, 70, 80% of the students who were at risk or struggling readers that they could not do whole group, in this case, word recognition instruction. So to differentiate it and to make sure every student was with an adult for that small group time of the universal tier, they had those other adults push in. So this schedule allowed that to happen. And if this seems overwhelming, this is too much for you to take on thinking about, try thinking about it for one grade level. Try prioritizing this just for kindergarten or just for KN1. Now, how are you going to know what your universal tier instruction should look like? That's what the screening data should tell you. And once you collect diagnostic data, that will inform it as well. But if you have a good direct screener, you'll know exactly what tier 1 should look like and exactly what you need to plan for in tier 2. You'll know it from the screening results. So here's a way that sometimes I have seen it play out in schools. Going back to the idea of the simple view of reading, knowing that we have to equip students with both word recognition and language comprehension, we can use our screening data to see how best to do that during the universal tier. We have to simultaneously and in tandem teach both capacities, but we don't necessarily have to do it in the same way. If you have a lot of students who are struggling with word recognition, like the examples that I've shown you, you might decide to do small group phonics instruction, no whole group phonics instruction, straight to small groups where all students at that grade level are grouped across the grade. They are in skill-alike groups, with the smallest groups being reserved for the most struggling students, and everybody is with an adult. While at the same time, there is heterogeneous whole group instruction back in homeroom, so to speak, for the language comprehension, the content building, the rich vocabulary, the complex sentence structure happening through explicit and systematic read alouds and discussion. This pivot point that I'm identifying here is where things change. When a student becomes accurate and fluent in text, that's when we shift to reading comprehension. It doesn't mean we stop doing the read aloud, but that's the point in time when we can expect and ask students to read text independently and demonstrate reading comprehension. And prior to that pivot point, that point of fluency, we should be doing these things separately. We should be building the language comprehension through read aloud, not asking students to read text that they can't actually read. So I want to go back to something that I said about flexible service delivery. So this is just another example of, this was a first grade schedule where they had 90 minutes for their universal instruction. And because they had so many needs around word recognition, they could see it in their universal screening. They saw it in ORF accuracy being low. They saw it in nonsense word fluency being low. They saw it in low phoneme segmentation fluency scores. This is how they decided to use their time during the universal tier. 45 minutes of whole group language comprehension instruction and 45 minutes of small group differentiated word recognition instruction. So all of the students were coming out of their homerooms, so to speak, to work with an adult, and the lowest, most struggling readers were in the smallest groups. So 18 students divided among 4 adults. This is something that sometimes people talk about as win time. It's a structure that some people have in place for their tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. What I'm suggesting is that we can't expect that what I need time, 30 to 45 minutes of intervention, to just be layered on top of 90 to 120 minutes of universal instruction that is not lined up to what students need. If you've just spent all that time collecting assessment data, doing diagnostics, figuring out exactly what each student needs, shouldn't we be providing it in universal instruction as well? That's what I think. That's what I've seen to work best, to accelerate progress and catch students up to those grade level expectations. We can accelerate learning. We can get every student to the same place by the end of first grade, but not with the same number of instructional minutes. We're going to have to provide that very carefully designed, explicit and systematic instruction to all students in a very planful and strategic way. And that might not be the way that you're currently organized. It might not be the way that you are used to or comfortable operating in your school. But if you want a different result for your students, you're going to have to operate differently. That's what MTSS is about. Taking what's in the reading research about what works best for instruction, for word recognition, and for language comprehension, and putting that in place, making it available for every student, whether they're a struggling reader or an advanced reader, putting that research in place for them so that they get what they need, not just in intervention, but first and foremost in tier 1 during that universal tier. Some students are going to need an extra dose at another time of day so that their progress is accelerated and that they catch up to where their non-struggling peers are performing. This is sort of like writing an intervention for your grade level, writing an intervention plan, not one student at a time, but writing an intervention plan for the system. I gave you 5 different areas to think about, 5 things that you could consider if you're not getting the results that you want for your students and that your students deserve. That's what I encourage you to think about as you're reading the book. I encourage you to think about and plan for this all summer, to think about, if you're not reading this over the summer as a school staff, to think about bringing the book back to your school or your district so that you can actually apply the wonderful ideas and approaches and strategies that are in this book to the benefit of your students. From chapter 1, the challenge then is to ensure that the positive changes are sustained and that less effective practices and strategies are not repeated. That's what the book is about. That's what MTSS is all about. It starts with universal instruction. It's not about special education. It's not about assigning kids to intervention. Those things might happen. It might be part of it. But first and foremost, it's about engineering a system that causes the vast majority of students to reach your reading expectations through the first way you teach reading in the regular classroom. Okay, Erin, hopefully you're not too flooded with questions, but if you've got a couple good ones there, this is the time.
Well, this was in a very astute group, I will say, and I'll just, we were talking behind the scenes that we're going to try to put together some resources for the secondary, intermediate, and high school level questions.
Oh, good.
Sort of outside the talk that you had today, but people have lots of questions regarding that. We do have a couple of questions that are related around, as you would expect, tier 1, small group and differentiation. So I'm going to start with many curriculums. I believe UFly even provide a grade level scope and sequence. This type of tier 1 seems to be opposite of this, that small group differentiation. Can you not do a short whole group lesson followed by grade level pacing and do what you need in your small groups and still be successful?
Well, you tell me, are you being successful? I'm not trying to be snarky. That's the actual answer. If doing a whole group lesson and then a small group pre-teach or reteach related to that whole group lesson gets 80% of your students to those benchmark goals, then it worked. Yes, you can do that. I've seen that work. It depends on the needs of your students. I don't think I've ever seen that work in scenarios like this, in a context like this. or only 17% or only 47% of students are on track. The difference between what you're teaching in whole group and where the student's skill is so big that you need every minute you can possibly scrape together to be providing instruction at the student's point of need, where they are currently. You can't afford to spend 20 or 30 or 40 minutes on something that's mismatched to what they need. You need every available minute in the school day targeted at what the student needs. So I'm not trying to make some kind of like blanket statements, except other than you should use your data to make these decisions, right? This model is not some ideal. It's not some cookbook that's just do these 6 things and, everything's fixed. This is about using your data to design a system of instruction that meets the needs of your students. If what you're doing is working, keep doing it. If what you're doing isn't working, do something different.
And the assessment is, how do you know?
How do
I
you
think
know?
that's really
This
important.
this is more green and blue. More kids are on track. That's promising. That's working.
Yeah.
This is not a lot of change. That's not working so much, right? So that's the reason to screen everybody 3 times a year. That's why you don't stop screening like the high kids at the winter or something like that. That's why you're screening universally, so that you can use the information for these system level decisions. Should I do whole group? Should I do small group? Right? These kinds of ideas. It depends on your data. How should you organize yourself? How should you use your adult resources? Should it be whole group? Should it be small group? This is not like, listen to some woman on a webinar and then just go do it. This is use your data to engineer a system that meets the needs of your students.
Thank you. We also have questions, which I think a lot of people have questions around. Can the small group tier 1 instruction have students from multiple grades?
Oh, good question. Yes. I was going so quickly here at the end that I blew past some of the detail. From multiple grades, your question is, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this example, this is from Sharon Dunn's school. When she was a principal in California, there were 4 first grade classes. So that's the illustration. But if you only have 1 section at each grade level, you might think about grouping across grades. You have to be really careful about that because of the social ramifications of a 2nd grader going to work with 1st graders. But if you're doing that sort of as a natural part of your daily operation, it's not just for reading time, then that can work where you're grouping across grade levels. And I would recommend just adjacent grade levels. So like 1st graders and 2nd graders, but not 1st and 3rd graders, because I think then you get into more of the difficulties socially for students who are struggling.
Okay. And we also had a question about motivation on some of the universal screening tools that are used. I'm thinking computer adapted. She feels that the student engagement with the screening process, students don't give their best effort, so it's tough to know what their skill level is. Do you have suggestions on how to get an accurate read of student skills? And she's talking about a little bit older students.
Yeah, I suggest getting an accurate read on student skills by listening to them perform the tasks. I think especially in the elementary grades, literacy, well, I have to start again because now this sentence doesn't make sense. I wasn't going to say exactly what I think. In all grades, literacy is the most important obligation of schools, but especially in the elementary grades, it's so high stakes. We have to get it right for kids that we can't leave it up to chance on a computer. This is my opinion. We shouldn't leave it up to chance for somebody's motivation, as the person is asking about, or their fine motor skills. We should have adults listening to students perform these essential skills. We should have somebody experience what it's like to listen to the child read. We should directly observe their behavior on screening. We have very brief tools that we can do this with. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. Now, when we get into, let's say 9th through 12th grade, do we need to do universal screening? I think that's an open question. I can be persuaded either way. Ask me tomorrow, I might have a different thought about it. Like I'm ambivalent on this topic because we can't prevent the problem from happening anymore. They already have a reading difficulty. And we already have a ton of data. So most folks who are really active in implementing MTSS at the high school level will tell you that they use what they call early warning systems. They use all of this pipeline of data that's already been collected about students. You have state assessments, you have grades, you have unit tests, you have achievement tests, you have screening from kindergarten to 8th grade on that child. Do you need additional indicators of reading difficulty? Maybe not. Maybe just for kids who transfer into your system. I think we probably still need to collect diagnostic data. And for those circumstances, I do recommend still listening to the student perform the skills, even at the high school level.
Thank you. I think Andrea is going to wrap us up. There are so many questions that are really important, and Dr. Stollar was very gracious in saying that she would be willing to answer some of those questions via email or another way that we can share those out, Andrea. So if you do have those lingering questions, be on the lookout for some answers provided. So thank you so much for your answering those questions live, and hang tight if your question didn't get answered yet.
Thank you for moderating those questions, Erin. You did a great job. Sorry to make you work so hard with all of that. And thanks again to
Great
everybody
questions.
behind the scenes who's made this event possible. I'm so looking forward to this book study this summer.
Yes.
Thank you both. That was great. And I just want to echo what Erin said. We can really see your engagement in the questions and how you're thinking about this. And so even though this slide says wrapping up, I want to encourage you that this is just the beginning, actually. We're hoping that this starts you thinking about your instruction in a little bit different way. How are we aligning our knowledge about the science of reading in an effective system? Let's start asking some questions. Let's start thinking about things differently. And dive in a little bit more into what makes an effective system of support across schools. And so this is the beginning. We'll dive into this book together and continue the conversation. But thank you, Dr. Stollar. Reading Science Academy is our event sponsor today, so we thank them for supporting this event and making it possible. You can learn more at readingscienceacademy.com, and we'll make sure to put that in the chat and send it out as well. I'd also like to encourage you to consider joining a chapter of the Reading League. We have 33 chapters now across the country, with several more coming on in the next year. If you enjoy learning about topics like the science of reading and MTSS, our chapters provide that local league of support to connect with others who also want to learn more and continue improving their instruction for their students. And so it's a great way to connect with other folks, other leaguers that are just like you. The QR code here will take you to the Reading League's newsletter, where we will share more about when new chapters launch. If you're still waiting for a chapter in your state, you can reach out to me anytime or sign up for the newsletter, and we'll be sure to let you know.